Good morning and welcome. My name is Aaron Stauffer, and I'm the Executive Director of Religions for Peace, USA. Welcome you, our viewers, to this co-sponsored webinar with the Religion Communicators Council called Confronting an Epidemic, Religious Community Responses to Ebola. We want to welcome you all of our viewers, to this webinar with Dr. Catherine Marshall of the Berkeley Center on Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, as well as Emily Miller, who is from the United Methodist Church, and will offer deep insights both from the Religion Communicators Council and then also in regard to the community responses that the United Methodist Church is facilitating to this crisis. Religions for Peace USA has been doing these webinars for a while now, and we featured experts and academics and activists on the ground who have deep insights and nuanced understandings of the issues that are most pressing to our religious communities. We seek to provide you with alternatives that you don't normally come across in the everyday media regarding these pressing issues. So today we're going to talk about Ebola and how religious communities both in the United States and abroad are responding to this crisis, and what are the ways in which they can be leveraged to be more effective and act in concert with governments and other health agencies to work against this. I really want to just jump right in and pose the first question to Dr. Catherine Marshall to speak a little bit about this conversation generally and where we are. We know we just received information this morning that the doctor was transferred to hospital in Sierra Leone. So this is something that is deeply on all of our minds today as we think about how we can work together across institutions and sectors to really to get a hold of this and understand where we are. Catherine, would you mind sort of setting the stage for us, pointing out the progress of how this has, this crisis has occurred and where we stand today?
The religious communities were involved in the Ebola crisis from the very earliest moment, because it was in clinics that were run by various largely Christian organizations that the first signs of a serious pandemic were emerging. So there are at least three ways in which the religious communities are deeply involved at this stage. But, and this is the but, the international response and the international community has not looked widely enough at the potential that religious communities offer for responding to the crisis. So the first is clearly the medical response. In other words, the clinics that are actually run by different religious communities, Catholic, Methodist, etc. And that's very important. The second is that this is an epidemic which involves behavior and beliefs, and there is a large focus now on burial practices as one of the most important ways in which the disease is spread. But there are also many other ways in which these highly religious societies, the leaders and the communities, the women's groups, the youth groups, could play central roles in helping to address the pandemic. So the question of engaging both religious and interreligious organizations is absolutely critical, and it's not easy because the religious landscape is so different from each of the different countries, but it is possible and it is absolutely essential. And the third is that already the good news is that we're seeing a reduction in the pandemic, particularly in Liberia, and there is at least hope that this will see an end. And there needs to be an extensive and thoughtful reflection on what this all means and what we learn for the future. And the religious dimension should be a very central part of that soul searching as to what we learn, what we missed, what was not done. Hello? Hello?
Catherine and Emily, are you here?
I'm here. Where did we lose contact?
I'm here.
My apologies. I'm not sure what happened. It seemed like we had some technical difficulties that was separate from any of our computers here. Catherine, would you mind starting back? I'm not sure how much of our viewers might have caught that. Again, we apologize, and something that sort of, technology is a blessing, but it has its own hiccups. So we appreciate your patience. Thank you for this. Catherine, would you mind jumping right back in?
Okay, well, I won't quite do the same thing, say the same thing, but there are many different ways in which religious communities and religious ideas and religious leaders should be central to the response to this really very frightening crisis, which is devastating for the countries involved, particularly Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, now Mali as well. But which also suggests a wide range of challenges and lessons for the international response, both to poverty broadly, but also to the West African crisis. So the three dimensions are clearly the medical, because so many of the facilities and the doctors and the nurses are associated with religiously linked communities in two of the countries, particularly, less so in Guinea. So they're on the forefront of the urgent response. The second is that the crisis, the pandemic, the epidemic cannot be stopped without changes in behavior. The most vivid example is burial practices that have a lot to do with religion and where religious leaders often preside. And there's been a tremendous effort to have safe and dignified burial as a key area, and there's collaboration with imams and pastors on that. So that's a second, but it's much broader than that. It's helping to regain the trust of communities so that they will believe what the doctors and the government officials tell them and not see this as a threat. The third area is that we really need to, as soon as the pandemic subsides, and there's some hopeful signs that it is in Liberia particularly, there's going to be, and there must be, a very dynamic reflection exercise on what we learn about global health, about the role of religious communities in responding to health challenges, in how the health relates to the development and the stability of the countries. And I think our objective, my objective in Georgetown University, but also the World Faiths Development Dialogue, is to find ways to ensure that religious actors are a central part of the inevitable and important reflection that's coming about what we learn and what we should do better next time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Catherine, for highlighting both sort of the challenges that we face and really confronting this epidemic, and both honing in a little bit on the challenges and how some of the necessary changes, particularly in behavior, that communities must must take and undertake in order to shift this in a healthy direction. Emily Miller, I wonder if you would share a little bit about the work that the United Methodist Church is doing and some of the stories that you all have heard, and I'm curious to some of the lessons that you all have learned and some of the key challenges that face this and the work for those who are on the ground in West Africa. Emily, are you there? It looks like we may have.
I'm sorry?
Are you with us, Emily?
Can you hear me?
Okay, yeah, please. Yes.
Okay,
yeah,
great. So first of all, we've been primarily working through locally based health boards in Liberia and Sierra Leone that have been strengthened as an out branch of a lot of the United Methodist Church's work in eradicating malaria, actually. And so the health boards have been our primary focus. We've also been working a lot on educating the public, as Catherine spoke to, around burial practices, around even just personal practices. For example, the bishops in both Sierra Leone and Liberia, primarily, have been imploring local pastors to dedicate 15 to 20 minutes of every sermon every week to talk about hygiene and practices, even down to the level of changing how they do passing of the peace. So kind of bowing instead of shaking hands or hugging. We've also been providing psychosocial support and really trying to remember that there are spiritual needs of the community as well as medical ones. Two of our United Methodist missionaries stayed in country despite having the option to leave, and 3 of our female missionaries have actually gone back about 2 weeks ago to help provide for support. Additionally, we've been working to make sure that primary needs continue to be supported as well as those secondary needs that I already spoke to. So the Disaster Response Agency of the United Methodist Church has provided grants for personal protective equipment, for pop-up tents and isolation units and those kinds of things. We anticipate requests for food assistance coming in the next week or so, and we'll be able to respond to that as well.
Emily, I'm curious. You mentioned that there was a pair of doctors who decided to return back and do this work, and I'm curious if you would speak to a little bit about the process and if there are ways in which people here in the United States can support these medical missionaries and the doctors who are doing this work, and both sort of what is the decision process and how are I'm curious to just it has to be a difficult decision for the doctors to take, but then also it would seem important to me too how of showing ways and highlighting ways that people here on the ground and in communities in the United States can further support the work that you all are doing. You mentioned one sort of very briefly is requests for food requests coming up, in which people right now can get connected, and how can they support this?
Yeah, so actually we had aid in Liberia, despite, of course, the option to come back to the United States. One is a hospital administrator and one is a doctor. And then we had 3 female missionaries who returned 2 weeks ago to Liberia and Sierra Leone. So in terms of support, one of the best ways that United States can be of support in that is to donate financially to the International Disaster Response part of the United Methodist Church, which can be found on www.umcor.org or www.umcmission.org, and you'll see there a banner that says response to Ebola, and people can donate online. Of course, we also implore people to be in prayer for the missionaries, but also for the people of Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Mali. We also have seen, and this is not dissimilar to the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the 80s, we've seen a little bit of some fear and stigmatization in the United States around people from West Africa, and just a heightening fear, which is not unusual in this day and age. But we would implore people to sort of remember that Africa is a large continent. Not everybody from Africa might have Ebola or be a transmitter of it. And just to be in prayer and remember that we're dealing with humans who are of human worth and have dignity and are all God's children.
Catherine, one of the points that Emily sort of mentioned here raises up a question in my mind, which I would like to pose to you around the sort of the similarity between this this pandemic that we're seeing of Ebola and what it's if there have been other world crises that you have in your knowledge of what we can compare Ebola to. I mean, is this something brand new? Is there something unique about it that religious communities and people on the ground ought to sort of be aware of? Or are there things that this is similar to that we can relate to and therefore understand in a more nuanced way? Both, you know, I think Emily has sort of mentioned the experience of the United Methodist Church in fighting malaria as well as HIV. But I'm curious to your experience both with both previously before you were at Georgetown with the World Bank, and then also right now with the Berkeley Center. Please, could you elaborate a little bit on sort of broadly this crisis, and is it brand new? Are there similarities in it that we see?
There's always been a fear of pandemic disease, whether it's the plague or bird flu or SARS or whatever. Ebola has some frightening features. The high mortality rate is clearly one. Estimated 70% of people who get it are dying. So it's clearly very frightening from that point of view. And it's also transmitted in ways that are unfamiliar and that lead to these rather frightening hazard suits that turn it into a visually very frightening. So it's understandable that people are terrified of this as a new kind of disease. But of course, the risk of pandemics is one that we've known for as long as human beings have been alive. Think of what smallpox and polio and these other very frightening diseases have done as well, and to transform societies. I think, though, what's important to focus on is the countries that this is affecting, where it is absolutely devastating. The official death toll is over 5,000. But probably there are many more people who've died in the countries. And there are several features of the countries that we really should focus on. The first is that these are societies, all three, that have experienced enormous conflict and tension, and therefore very weak government services, and particularly health services. So these are societies that are among the very poorest in the world, where children have very little chance of looking to a better life. And they are the kinds of countries that our hearts go out to, and that need the most creative and the most committed support we can provide. So that's a first, is the weakness of these societies. Other societies have been able to respond much more effectively to the crisis than Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea. The second is that these are highly religious societies. By far the most active organizations in the societies, whether providing health, taking care of orphans, giving hope to people, giving the kind of pastoral support, keeping communities together, the glue, are religious figures. And that includes traditional religious leaders, but also a wide variety of Christian denominations and Muslim. In fact, the majority of the populations of the countries are Muslim. And there are, for that reason, some interreligious organizations that mainly grew up to try to resolve the conflict. So they were not there to respond to this crisis, but there is something to build on, and therefore to take this religious network, this religious character of these societies deeply into account when the very large international response is planned and delivered.
Thank you for that. Catherine, can you speak to some of the specific challenges that governments and large bodies face in leveraging large sort of public response to this? What are some of the challenges that we face on the one hand, Emily had sort of spoken about the need to correct a fair amount of misinformation and fear that follows from these, as you pointed out, some signals that make it sort of unfamiliar, large medical suits that doctors have to wear to prevent themselves from spreading the disease. And so talk a little bit more at sort of the larger sort of governmental level here. What are some of the challenges?
Let me try to divide my answer into two parts. One is the sort of short term versus long term, and then the second is the sort of medical health, and then the second is the broader. So in the short term, there's a very large mobilization which is delivering the kinds of medical supplies, building facilities so that there are beds, reaching into the remote communities where the disease is spreading rapidly. And in some senses, there it is the religious organizations that are part of the healthcare system that are at the forefront. And we did a survey in the Berkeley Center and WFDD of the remarkable and creative responses that different religious communities are coming up with. But many of them say they still are not receiving the supplies they need. It still is mobilizing as opposed to really delivering. So in the short term, I think there has to be a focus on public information and on the medical side. But in the longer term, what it tells us is new strategies for these countries are absolutely essential. And the health services are clearly inadequate and need to be built up. So that's the sort of short-term, long-term. And I referred before to the fact that there is going to be a very intensive effort to draw lessons, and the religious aspects need to be a central, not a peripheral, a central part of that reflection. The second is, and Emily referred to this, is that the disease itself, of course, is only affecting a small portion of the populations of these countries. It's a handful. We're barely at a handful in the United States and other countries. The number of people who die in car crashes or swimming pool deaths is far greater than the number of people who are dying outside of West Africa from the disease. But it's having far-ranging effects. Emily referred to the fact that there's not enough food and the travel bans are devastating, not to speak of tourism. Just people can't come and go easily. They're frightened. It's an erosion of trust in the government of the countries, but probably also of the United States and other countries, as people feel that they've been abandoned. So investment is stopping, trade is stopping. Morocco has canceled its FIFA games because of fear of Ebola. There are conferences all over West Africa, far, thousands of miles away, from where the Ebola pandemic is that are being canceled. So it's people are talking about the possibility of collapse of these societies. So clearly, it's a frightening disease. It's been a very insidious enemy, but it is also something that's having effects far beyond. And the need for people to be informed, to be thoughtful, to take care of themselves, but also not to allow the fear of a mysterious disease, which seems to come from the devil, to allow the countries to strangle. So I think one of the lessons from that is for us to be rational in the way that we think about the disease and the countries. And the second is that just as soon as the pandemic subsides, as I said, it seems to be doing in Liberia, there's a need to regroup and to do everything possible to allow these countries to catch up. There are many estimates of what this is going to cost. It's in the billions of dollars, but also in the years of development. And I think one of the most vivid symbols is that there's a whole new group of orphans who are, in some senses, the most poignant example of what's happening, because even orphans whose parents have died or who've had the disease and have recovered, people are afraid to take care of them. So it's only a few very courageous souls who are doing anything, even to give food to these orphans, much less to comfort and love them. So they become, this new group of orphans become a symbol of the pandemic.
Thank you. That's a powerful and very poignant image of understanding the true sort of impact of both on human, but then also, as you were sort of on structural, of how a country with a generation of orphans, or I mean, as is now how to properly take care of them. And I think this raises a lot of questions of what are the stories that really inspire us and give us hope in response to this, and how do we, as members of our own faith communities, participate, as you so rightly pointed out, that the religious communities ought to be at the center of this process and responding into analyzing and understanding how to move forward on this too. So I think that's all of those points are well taken, and those are right on. So thank you for that. But Emily, I'm curious to that is to Catherine's symbol there is interesting, and something that I think we have to hold in tension with other stories that sort of point out what some of the successes are of of courageous individuals who are continuing to go back and to do this work. Could you talk a little bit more broadly, perhaps about some of what what the United Methodist Church is doing? Now, you spoke briefly on two stories of medical missionaries returning, but I'm curious on sort of more broadly, what are the plans for the United Methodist Church specifically, and also, what are your anticipations for religious communities in taking responses to crises like this, and how do you communicate to all of your members that this is something that you are committed to? Would you mind speaking to that?
Sure. And just to clarify, the medical missionaries were the two who never left the country. The sort of more typical missionaries are the ones who went back. So they're not medical specialists necessarily, but are engaged in that work that Catherine was speaking a little bit to about, sort of the expanded effects of a medical crisis such as this. We're more used to dealing with a natural disaster, an earthquake, with education, working to reintegrate the orphans that she was talking about with their extended families and their communities, so that we're not just setting up sort of an orphanage model as we've seen in the past. But these are cultures in which extended family is very strong. And so how do we then work in community-based education to not just combat the medical situation, but the cultural one as well, particularly, as she was saying, in decades, if not generations, of effects from civil wars around lack of education, lack of opportunities for women and girls, those types of things. So how do we take really an integrated long-range approach to all of those different issues and challenges, rather than just addressing the primary immediate medical needs?
Absolutely. Well, thank you both. This has been a rich and wonderful conversation that has many facets here, both at the long term and in the specific stories that we've heard. But one of the things that Religions for Peace is committed to is through the framework of multi-religious cooperation across religious boundaries in order to inspire and activate common actions for peace. And I want to highlight that and really see if we can home in a little bit on how religious communities working across and throughout all sort of boundaries, what is the potential for this? And in your insights, how much of a necessity is it? And I think personally that it's a high necessity that we work across and within all of our traditions in order to leverage the most powerful response to Ebola. Perhaps I think I just want to home in a little bit on that and sort of see what your insights on this are. Is on the one hand, there's this challenge of making sure that we clearly communicate to others, one, to dispel fear and to provide correct information, both on the unfamiliar aspects of Ebola, but then also on the familiar aspects of how our religious communities are well equipped to respond to crises like these. But oftentimes I think we forget on the necessity to work across all boundaries in order to galvanize and leverage the strongest support. So perhaps I just want to raise that quickly to either of you to how important is it that we work across religious boundaries in order to respond to this?
Well, in the United States, I think that it is to the religious communities, both individually and collectively, that we look for moral clarity and for conveying that this is our responsibility, that we live on a small planet, that no matter how far away these seem, these are God's children who are suffering and who need support. The prophetic voice, the willingness to be courageous and to speak out on this issue as on the other issues we're dealing with on terrorism and fundamentalism and so forth. There's another dimension which came out of our reviews of the religious dimensions of the crisis. The first is that religious communities have a lot of new technologies which are being used very creatively. So using mobile phones and tweets and so forth as part of this effort to communicate, I think has been something that came to a large extent out of religious communities. And the second is the roles of diaspora communities. In other words, each of these countries have people living in the United States who are members of churches, in many cases, or mosques, and they're very much in touch with what's happening at home. So looking to these communities for understanding and information and support is, I think, very important. So in many ways, a crisis focuses the mind, and that's my hope, that we can learn from this crisis, both how fragile these societies are, how much resilience they have, the courage of the people in villages and communities who are gaining strength from their beliefs and from their social ties. On the other hand, there are also some challenges which we hadn't focused on as much. One thing that we're very aware of is how much mapping work needs to be done to understand better how the religious communities relate. How, for example, the traditional religious leaders relate to some of the evangelical and Pentecostal, as well as to the government, how the Catholic Church relates to some of the Muslim communities. So this is both interreligious, but it's also within very specific communities. And we don't know enough. There's not enough knowledge in the international organizations, partly because there hasn't been this discussion in a coherent way before. So that's what my hope is, that we can use the tragedy and the moment of crisis to refocus our minds so that we look much more creatively at what the religious networks are and how they can work together and how they can work with the governments in the countries, but also the international organizations, WHO, UNICEF, UNAIDS, the World Bank, all of the African Development Bank, all of the other organizations that are providing support, that they can see this religious dimension much more clearly as they look ahead.
One of the things in our last conversation with Omid Safi, Ryan Craybill, and Jerusha Lamptey regarding a response and religious communities' response to the Islamic State was made by Ron Craybill, who's a United Nations consultant, senior peace builder based in Manila. And his point was interesting because he contrasted something that I think resonates with what you just said there, Catherine, which was that for people in the United States, there is an interesting division between people's religious sensibilities and then their public and medical and political aspects too, their sides. And he said, you know, to the rest of the world, religion is very integrated. It's part of people's lives, and the communities and the social networks that are religious communities and our religious social networks are also political, and also you know, they are. It's all very integrated and messy. And so I think that's something to keep in mind, is that as we begin to work across these boundaries, both in the United States but then also abroad, we have to see that we deal with people who are deeply invested in all aspects of their lives. And so as we begin to leverage you know, our collective power in the United States, in the religious communities in the United States, we have to keep in mind that, you know, that people are multifaceted, and that as we begin to work you know, across these boundaries, that we are doing so in a way that also requires some sort of translation about how we begin to talk about working with these, working with different partners. That also religious communities, though, provide a vital insight into the aspect of people's lives, as we've been pointed out many times during this conversation, both in if there is going to be some strong response, then there has to be some correction in behavior. And religious leaders, as Emily has sort of said, in delegating time towards within sermons on responses, but then also, as Catherine has mentioned, around burial practices. Those are interesting points that all are pertinent to the proper response to Ebola. And for people in the United States, I think that as we begin to gain insight on how we have a unique division between our religious lives and our public lives, that we have to do, in turn, a translation as we begin to understand and relate to people who don't have to do that translation and that sort of division between our lives. And so I think that's just something that's both a cultural and religious and political understanding of what a proper response, both within the United States and understanding and getting a greater perspective of this, but then also on how we can work together across religious boundaries and cultural boundaries too. I think those are some just sort of interesting things to keep in mind. I recognize that we're getting close to the time when we ought to wrap up the conversation. I want to thank both Catherine and Emily for their insights and their perspectives and their time this morning. I want to give Emily a chance and Catherine to respond and add any last comments here before we wrap up. Do either of you want to highlight any other aspects?
Yeah, I just wanted to address the religious question that you were just speaking to just briefly also, because I think it's so important to realize that how we work structurally also informs what happens on the ground, and that it's very important for people to understand that the United Methodist Church, in working to address this crisis, does not work alone. We work with a variety of interfaith, ecumenical, and NGO partners that any assistance provided by the United Methodist Church is not to United Methodists alone or to Christians alone. And I think that helps people on the ground really understand and address some of the fear and stigma again, that this disease is not a curse from God, that it is not a punishment for a lack of faith or anything like that. And as Catherine said, these are highly religious communities, and despite whatever religion or lack thereof, that these partner organizations and interfaith organizations are there to support all people, as they are all God's children.
Those, thank you, Emily. Those are wonderful comments, and I completely agree that with the rich quality of what the response has been, and I hope that we'll be able to tell the story of what people have done, both individually and as institutions, effectively, as we look to the lessons learned phase. I wanted to emphasize something Aaron just said, that this is integrated and messy. And that's important. It's important in this, as it was in the case of HIV/AIDS, to recognize that religion or religious beliefs, ideas, and institutions and leaders are part of the problem to a degree, but they're also part of the solution. And I think we need to look at this objectively, and that's part of telling the story. There are cases where the disease has been spread because of misinformation that came from trusted religious leaders. And it's all understandable, but that puts much more emphasis on the need to engage with the religious leaders. It's very messy. They're competitive denominations. We know that the sheer density of religious institutions, buildings, schools, health centers, women's groups, children's groups, youth groups, is probably denser than any other organization that exists in these countries, but they overlap, and there's not even a directory, much less a central office. So for the international organizations, they're finding it difficult to know who to talk to. So that's another lesson that we can learn. That's what we call the mapping exercise, so that we know much better, so that we have a clearer idea. But the bottom line is that there is no institution, there are no leaders more trusted and more important in these societies than this rich network of religious institutions, and they need to be at the table as we think, as we take stock, and as we look to the future.
Amen. I think that's absolutely right on. I think that's one of the things that drives much of Religions for Peace USA's work, is that we understand that there is this general sense within some sectors of the public that religion is viewed as a problem and a cause of many of the world's problems. But we wholeheartedly believe that religion can and ought to be part of the solution. And the rich and deep resource that our religious traditions are in providing alternatives, and as you've mentioned, sort of some of the in some traditions, and especially the Christian and the Judaic traditions around the prophetic response, can provide an alternative to some of the world's problems, and how we can plumb these resources and really draw on the insights and the deep and vast social networks within and across the world that the religious leaders have to provide for both the conduit and part of the content of the message that we need to provide in order to move together and to care for all of the world and all people of the world. I think these are deep aspects that we hold true and really drive a lot of Religions for Peace USA's work to work across the boundaries in order to galvanize on the resources and the power that we have. So thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Emily, so much for this time. I think it's been a wonderful conversation. You both have mentioned a couple of resources that I think are important that the viewers have access to. Emily has mentioned ways in which people on the ground here in the United States can support the work that the United Methodist Church is doing, along with its many and diverse partners on the ground. And Catherine has mentioned some of the deep need of doing more resource mapping and understanding sort of who are the players on the ground, what are their needs, and what are the challenges that they're facing. So if, with both of your permissions, I'd like to be able to provide that to the viewers. There's a couple of documents that I have seen and that we can make available to our viewers. So thank you both very much for this time. Thank you to all the viewers who have tuned in, and we'll be back again with in the coming months with pertinent and important topics to you that we provide nuanced and insightful comments by activists and experts who are here to equip you and educate you on what are the ways in which we can properly respond to these issues. So thank you, and we'll be in touch very shortly. Thank you.